Garrett Sullivan stood in the dim amber light of Riverside Grill, the worn vinyl booth creaking beneath him as he slid into the seat across from Eleanor Whitmore. The woman's mascara had carved dark rivers
It's
down
gonna
her
be
cheeks,
okay.
and her hands
I'm here
trembled
for
as they
you.
clutched a cloth napkin that had already absorbed more tears than fabric should hold. Between them sat a dinner check for $287, wine she hadn't ordered, appetizers she hadn't touched, and the crystallized shame of waiting 90 minutes for a man who would never return. Eleanor's eyes lifted, recognition flooding her face with something worse than surprise. Horror, maybe. The kind that comes when the last person you want to see you broken is the only one who stayed. Garrett's voice came out quieter than he intended. "May I sit here, Eleanor? I don't think a good woman should have to finish this evening alone." The restaurant's Friday night crowd had thinned, but not enough. Whispers still circulated from nearby tables, forks pausing mid-air as strangers catalogued the details of an old woman's humiliation. Garrett had watched it unfold from his own booth 20 feet away, where his daughter Ruby sat with her geometry homework spread across the table, a reward dinner for straight A's that had turned into something else entirely. 6 hours earlier, Garrett had been 40 feet underground in the Hendersons' basement, his headlamp cutting through dust motes as he traced a fault in their electrical panel. The smell of burning insulation had greeted him before he'd even opened the breaker box, that acrid chemical stink that meant something had been failing slowly for months, maybe years. He knelt on the concrete floor, multimeter in hand, and began the diagnostic dance that had defined the past 20 years of his life. The main panel was a Federal Pacific stab lock from 1987. The kind that had prompted recalls and lawsuits and insurance companies dropping coverage. Garrett ran his fingers along the bus bars, feeling for the telltale warmth that indicated resistance, loose connections, imminent disaster. His meter confirmed what his nose had suspected. The 240-volt feed to the dryer circuit was pulling irregular current voltage, dropping from 245 to 198. And spiking back up. The breaker should have tripped. Instead, it had been cooking itself from the inside, heating and cooling and heating again, until the contacts had begun to weld. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the top of the basement stairs, her silhouette backlit by the kitchen fluorescence. "How bad is it, Garrett?" He clicked off his headlamp and climbed the stairs, wiping dust from his hands onto jeans that had seen 100 crawl spaces. "Bad enough that I'm surprised you still have a house. This panel needs to be replaced and I need to do it today. The breaker's failed. It won't trip even under fault conditions. You're one power surge away from a fire." The number he quoted her was fair, $3,800 for a complete 200-amp service upgrade, with new panel, new breakers, new grounding system. She wrote the check without haggling because she'd taught Ruby to read at the public library every Saturday for 3 years, never charging a dime, always patient when the dyslexia made simple words into impossible puzzles. By the time Garrett had finished roughing in the new panel and running fresh circuits, the October sun had dropped below the tree line and his back ached in that specific way that meant he'd been kneeling too long. He locked his tools in the truck bed, the battered F-150 that had 240,000 miles and a transmission that slipped in third gear but kept running because Garrett knew how to baby it through the rough patches. Ruby was waiting on the Hendersons' front porch, backpack beside her nose in a paperback that looked too thick for a sixth grader. She glanced up as he approached her eyes, his eyes the same slate gray that turned silver in certain light, tracking him with that uncomfortable perception kids develop when they've had to grow up watching adults carefully. "Did you finish? Panels in, energized and tested, were good." He reached down and ruffled her hair, a gesture she tolerated now, but wouldn't in another year or two. "How about we hit Riverside Grill, celebrate those report card numbers?" Ruby's face lit up with the smile that still after 11 years made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. "Can I get dessert?" You earned it. The drive into town took 15 minutes along Route 47 past farmland that had been subdivided into 5-acre lots past the shuttered textile mill that had employed half the county until 2003. Past the First Methodist Church where Garrett and Ruby showed up every Sunday because community mattered and because Pastor Caleb Morrison had been the only person to visit him every week during the divorce when Garrett couldn't get out of bed. The divorce. 8 years gone, and it still arrived in his thoughts like a bill he'd forgotten to pay, the kind that compounds interest until the original debt is unrecognizable. He'd been 34. Ruby had been 3, and Vanessa had been very clear about her reasons for leaving. The words still played in perfect fidelity. I didn't sign up for a life of fixing other people's electrical problems while living in a house that needs its own repairs. David can give me the life I actually want. David, now Donovan Pierce, apparently, since he'd legally changed his name after some business scandal Garrett never bothered investigating. The man owned a construction company, drove a Mercedes, lived in a house with a 3-car garage. Vanessa had moved from electrician's wife to contractor's wife, and apparently found the upgrade satisfactory. She saw Ruby maybe 4 times a year, always scheduling visits around her real estate showings, always leaving early because something had come up. The memory that hurt most wasn't the leaving, it was the custody hearing where Eleanor Whitmore had sat beside her daughter, silent as a stone, while Vanessa's lawyer read a statement about Garrett's lack of ambition and unstable income and inability to provide the lifestyle Vanessa and Ruby deserved. Eleanor had met his eyes once during the proceedings, and in that glance he'd seen something that might have been apology or might have been nothing at all. She'd chosen her daughter over truth, which Garrett understood even as it carved something permanent out of his chest. He hadn't seen Eleanor since that courthouse hallway 8 years ago, when she'd tried to approach him and he'd turned away because there was nothing left to say. Riverside Grill occupied a converted train depot from the 1920s, all exuded brick and reclaimed wood. The kind of place that served burgers and craft beer and stayed busy, because it was the only restaurant in town that wasn't a chain. Garrett guided Ruby to a booth near the windows, the vinyl patched with duct tape but clean, the table wobbling slightly until he folded a napkin under the short leg. Ruby ordered a mushroom Swiss burger and a Sprite. Garrett got the meatloaf special and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed around lunchtime. They talked about her math test 94%, one careless error on a word problem, and her science project on renewable energy, and whether she should try out for the school play even though she was terrified of singing in front of people. Then Garrett glanced toward the back corner of the dining room and felt the past reach across 8 years to grab him by the throat. Eleanor Whitmore sat alone at a table for 2. Her posture rigid in the way of women who'd taught elementary school for 40 years and couldn't shake the habit of perfect alignment even in private moments. She wore a navy dress that looked new pearls that caught the overhead light hair done at a salon instead of the simple bun he remembered. Her hands kept checking her phone, setting it down. Picking it up, the movements growing more agitated with each cycle. Ruby followed his gaze. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Eat your dinner." But he couldn't stop watching. Eleanor kept glancing at the entrance, smoothing her dress, touching her hair. At 7:15, a man arrived, mid-60s, expensive suit, the kind of silver hair that came from a stylist rather than genetics. He approached Eleanor's table with practiced charm. Hand-extended smile wide enough to show too many teeth. Garrett couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read the body language. Eleanor stood awkward and eager, shaking the man's hand too long. They sat. The man, sterling something Garrett's mind supplied from nowhere, ordered wine without consulting Eleanor, expensive bottles, judging by the waitress's reaction. He talked and Eleanor listened, leaning forward, laughing at intervals that seemed slightly offbeat. Ruby had returned to her homework oblivious. Garrett pushed Meatloaf around his plate and tried to focus on anything except the table in the corner. He failed comprehensively. At 7:45, Sterling's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting through surprise and concern, before settling on apologetic. He stood gesturing vaguely toward the door, mouthing words Garrett couldn't decipher. Eleanor nodded, understanding and patient. Sterling squeezed her shoulder and headed for the exit. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Eleanor's posture began to change, confidence draining vertebra by vertebra until she sat hunched and small. She checked her phone, tried calling someone, waited. At the 20-minute mark, she stood and walked to the entrance, pushing through the door to check the parking lot. When she returned, her face had lost all color. Garrett's stomach twisted. He'd seen enough in 42 years to recognize abandonment when it wore a navy dress and pearls. The restaurant's ambient noise continued, silverware on plates, conversations about nothing. The hiss of the kitchen, but Garrett heard it through cotton, distant and muffled. Eleanor sat back down with the careful movements of someone trying not to shatter. Other diners had noticed. A woman at the next table whispered to her husband. A teenager smirked at his date. The waitress approached with professional sympathy and a check. Eleanor opened her purse with shaking hands. She pulled out a credit card, slid it across the table. The waitress took it and disappeared. Returned 2 minutes later with that specific expression service workers get when they have to deliver bad news. The card had been declined. Eleanor tried another. Same result. She emptied her wallet onto the table, counting bills with fingers that couldn't stay steady. $8 in mixed denominations. The check was for $287. The restaurant had gone quiet in the way crowds do when they sense disaster and can't look away. Eleanor's breathing had gone shallow, her chest rising and falling too fast. She looked around as if searching for options that didn't exist, and her gaze landed on Garrett. Recognition hit her like voltage. Her eyes went wide, moisture gathering at the corners, and something in her face broke completely. Not tears yet. Just the collapse that precedes them, the moment when dignity becomes impossible to maintain. Ruby noticed finally, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "Dad, that lady looks really sad." Garrett's daughter had her mother's face, but none of her mother's capacity for looking away from suffering. She'd inherited something else instead, his curse maybe of seeing pain and feeling obligated to do something about it. "Ruby, do you recognize her?" The girl squinted across the restaurant. "Should I? That's your grandmother, your mom's mother." Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. Ruby had asked about grandparents before, questions Garrett had deflected with half-truths about distance and complicated relationships. The child knew she had a grandmother on Vanessa's side, but had never met her, never received birthday cards or Christmas presents existed in that theoretical space where family members lived without manifesting. Ruby's voice dropped to a whisper. "Why doesn't she visit us?" "It's complicated, baby. She looks really alone." The observation landed like a verdict. Garrett sat there with his cold meatloaf and his daughter's geometry homework and the weight of 8 years pressing down on his shoulders. He could finish his meal, pay his check, drive Ruby home, and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Eleanor would figure something out, call someone, work it out with the restaurant, survive the humiliation alone like she'd probably survived 1,000 other humiliations. Or the choice should have been harder. It should have required deliberation, weighing consequences, consulting the ledger of old wounds and unpaid debts. Instead, Garrett found himself standing before he'd consciously decided to move his body, executing a decision his mind hadn't finished processing. "Stay here, Ruby. I'll be right back." He crossed the restaurant in 10 strides, feeling every eye track his movement. Eleanor didn't look up until he reached her table, and when she did, the expression on her face cycled through horror and shame and something that might have been relief before settling into blank shock. "Garrett," her voice came out broken. I didn't know I wouldn't have." He slid into the booth across from her, the vinyl creaking under his weight, and picked up the check the waitress had left on the table. $287.34. 2 bottles of wine. He'd watched Sterling order appetizers. Eleanor hadn't touched an entree that sat cold and untouched on its plate. The words came out steadier than he felt. "I'd like to pay this check, and I'd appreciate the company for a few minutes if you're willing." Eleanor's hands flew to her face, pressing against her cheeks as if she could physically hold herself together. "Garrett, I can't let you after everything. You don't owe me anything." "I know." "Then why?" The question deserved a better answer than he could articulate. Something about seeing someone drowning and having a rope within reach. Something about his daughter watching from across the room and learning what kind of man her father chose to be when no one was keeping score. Something about the look in Eleanor's eyes 8 years ago in that courthouse hallway, that flash of regret he'd turned away from, because mercy felt impossible when you were bleeding. He flagged down the waitress, handed her his credit card, and asked her to combine the 2 checks. Eleanor made a sound that might have been a protest or might have been a sob. Other diners had gone back to their meals, the moment's drama having resolved itself without spectacle. "The man who was here," Garrett said quietly. "Where did he go?" Eleanor's laugh came out wet and bitter. "I don't know. He got a phone call, said it was an emergency, stepped outside. His car is gone. He's not answering his phone." She paused, then added with the precision of someone cataloging their own stupidity, "He also apparently stole my credit cards when I went to the restroom. Both of them." "How many times have you met him?" "3. This was supposed to be our 3rd date." Her fingers twisted the napkin into tortured shapes. "I met him on Silver Connections. It's a dating site for seniors. He seemed kind, attentive. He talked about his late wife and his grandchildren, and God, I'm such a fool." "You're lonely. That's different from foolish." "Is it?" Eleanor's eyes met his, and in them Garrett saw the same bone-deep exhaustion he remembered from his own reflection during the worst of the divorce. "My husband Bill died 5 years ago. Vanessa hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. I wake up every morning in an apartment where I don't know my neighbors, eat breakfast alone, spend my days volunteering at a library that's cutting hours, and go to bed wondering if this is just what the rest of my life looks like. When Sterling, the man who just left, when he messaged me and said I had a beautiful smile, I wanted to believe him so badly I ignored every red flag." The waitress returned with Garrett's card and 2 receipts. He signed both and stood extending his hand to Eleanor. "Come on, I'm driving you home." "Garrett, you've done enough." "Eleanor," his voice came out firmer than intended, "you're coming with me. Ruby's here, my daughter, your granddaughter. She deserves to meet you properly, and you deserve to not sit in this restaurant alone for 1 more minute." Eleanor took his hand, because pride had already been stripped away, and what was left wasn't strong enough to refuse kindness. Ruby looked up from her homework as they approached, her eyes going wide at the proximity of the woman she'd only known as an abstract concept. Garrett made the introductions with simple efficiency. "Ruby, this is Eleanor Whitmore, your grandmother. Eleanor, this is Ruby, but I guess you already knew that." Eleanor's composure, already fragile, shattered completely. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over, despite her obvious attempts to contain them. "You're so beautiful. You look just like—" She stopped, redirected. "You look like yourself, completely yourself." Ruby glanced at Garrett for guidance. He nodded, and she slid out of the booth to stand awkwardly in front of the woman who shared her blood but not her history. Hi, it's nice to meet you. Would it be okay if I hugged you? Ruby nodded and Eleanor pulled her into an embrace that lasted 3 seconds too long to be casual, her shoulders shaking with the effort of not sobbing audibly. When they separated, Ruby looked simultaneously pleased and uncomfortable the way kids do when adult emotions overflow their boundaries. The drive to Eleanor's apartment took 12 minutes through the eastern neighborhoods where the houses got smaller and the streetlights worked intermittently. Garrett followed her directions to a complex called Oakwood Terrace, which was neither oak-lined nor terraced, just 3 two-story buildings arranged around a parking lot cratered with potholes. Eleanor's unit was on the second floor, accessed by an external staircase with a railing that wobbled under Garrett's hand. Inside the apartment was clean but sparse. A couch from the 70s, a small television on a particle board stand, photographs on the wall, Eleanor and a man who must have been Bill younger and smiling at a beach somewhere. No photos of Vanessa, no photos of Ruby. Eleanor moved through the space with apologetic gestures. I know it's not much. After Bill died, I couldn't afford the house on my pension. This was what I could manage. Ruby wandered to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. You have a lot of books about teaching. I taught 3rd grade for 40 years. Old habits. Eleanor's voice softened. Do you like to read? Dad and I read together every night. We just finished Wonder for the 3rd time. The conversation was small and careful, 2 strangers finding purchase on uncertain ground. Garrett let it flow around him while his eyes cataloged the details Eleanor hadn't mentioned. The eviction notice taped to the refrigerator, bright orange and impossible to miss, giving her 10 days to vacate or face legal action. The bills stacked on the kitchen counter, red stamped final notice visible on several envelopes. The refrigerator's sparse contents: yogurt past its date, condiments, not much else. Eleanor caught him looking. Her shoulders dropped another degree. I suppose there's no point in hiding it. I'm 3 months behind on rent. The eviction is official as of yesterday. How much do you owe? No, $2,400. Plus late fees, it's closer to $3,000. She laughed without humor. I had it saved, every penny. Then last month someone called claiming to be from the IRS, said I owed back taxes, that I'd be arrested if I didn't pay immediately. I gave them access to my account to resolve the issue. They took everything. Ruby looked up from the book's, alarm on her face. Grandmother, that's terrible. The word grandmother hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sat down hard on the couch, hands pressed to her face. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you shouldn't have to see me like this. I'm supposed to be the adult, the one who has things figured out, and instead I'm... Her voice broke. I'm homeless in 10 days and I don't know what to do. Garrett sat down across from her, elbows on his knees. Ruby stood uncertain in the middle of the room, clearly wanting to help, but unsure how. The silence stretched until Garrett broke it with the question that had been building since the restaurant. Why did you and Vanessa stop talking? Eleanor wiped her eyes, leaving mascara smudges that made her look older and more fragile. 3 years ago, I told her the truth about Donovan. I'd seen him at a restaurant with another woman, heard him talking to his business partner about some deal that sounded illegal. I told Vanessa she'd made a mistake leaving you for him, that you were a good man and Donovan was... She stopped, glancing at Ruby. It's okay, Ruby said quietly. I know Mom left Dad. Eleanor continued. Vanessa told me I was jealous, that I'd spent 40 years married to a carpenter who worked himself to death for a modest life. And I couldn't stand that she'd found something better. She said if I couldn't support her choices, I wasn't welcome in her life. I haven't heard from her since. The revelation sat in the room like a third person. Garrett processed it in stages, first the information itself, then the implications, then the weight of Eleanor's isolation. She'd chosen truth over relationship and lost both. Ruby's small voice cut through his thoughts. "Is that why you never visited me?" Eleanor's face crumpled. "Baby, I wanted to. Every birthday, every Christmas, every random Tuesday, I wanted to show up and know you. But your mother made it clear I could have her or I could have you, but not both. And I was too much of a coward to fight for you when it meant losing my only child completely. But you lost her anyway." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "I lost her anyway." Garrett stood abruptly, the weight of the evening pressing down until sitting still became impossible. He walked to the window, looked out at the parking lot where a streetlight flickered and died, then came back to life. Behind him, he heard Ruby ask Eleanor questions about teaching, about books, about the world in the careful way children have of trying to fix adult pain by changing the subject. He'd come here to pay a restaurant check and deliver Eleanor safely home. The evening should have ended 5 minutes ago with polite goodbyes and a mutual agreement to forget this awkward intersection of past and present. Instead, he was standing in an apartment that smelled like old carpet and loneliness, watching his daughter bond with the grandmother who'd abandoned her, listening to a woman describe a life that had narrowed to the width of survival. The smart move was to leave, wish Eleanor well, maybe slip her some cash for groceries, drive Ruby home, and pretend this detour hadn't happened. He had his own life to manage, a business that barely broke even most months, a daughter who needed stability, a carefully maintained distance from anything connected to Vanessa. But Ruby was looking at Eleanor with something like hope, and Eleanor was looking at Ruby like she'd been drowning and someone had finally thrown her a rope. And Garrett was thinking about that courthouse hallway 8 years ago when Eleanor had tried to apologize and he'd turned away, about the expression on her face, then not just regret but something deeper. Grief, maybe, for all the ways love makes cowards of us when we're afraid of losing what little we have left. The decision formed before he could interrogate it properly. He pulled out his phone and made a note to himself. Research eviction laws call. Pastor Caleb about church assistance fund check if Eleanor qualified for emergency housing support. Then he turned back to the two people who were genetically connected but functionally strangers, united only by circumstance, and his inexplicable inability to walk away from suffering even when it came attached to his own painful history. "Eleanor, I need to take Ruby home. School night." He paused, then added before he could reconsider, "But I'm going to help you figure this out. The eviction, the money, the whole situation. I'm not going to let you end up on the street." Eleanor stood so fast she knocked over a stack of books on the coffee table. "Garrett, no. You've already done too much. After what happened during the divorce, after I didn't speak up for you when I should have, you don't owe me anything. You don't even owe me basic decency, and you've given me more than that tonight. I know I don't owe you. That's not why I'm doing it." "Then why?" He looked at Ruby, who was watching him with that uncomfortable perception kids develop when they've learned to read their parents for signs of danger. She needed to understand this moment, not just witness it, but comprehend what was being decided and why. Because sometimes doing the right thing has nothing to do with what's fair or what's owed. Sometimes you do it because you're trying to teach your kid that kindness matters even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The words came out rougher than intended, scraping past the part of him that wanted to protect Ruby from exactly this kind of complication. But she was 11, old enough to see that life offered forks in the road where every option hurt. But some hurt in ways you could live with, and others left scars that never healed. Eleanor made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're a better person than I deserve, Garrett Sullivan." "I'm just a person, Eleanor, trying to do a little better than yesterday." They left with promises to talk tomorrow to figure out next steps to somehow transform disaster into something survivable. Ruby hugged Eleanor goodbye, brief and awkward but genuine, and the sight of it opened something in Garrett's chest that had been sealed for 8 years. In the truck, Ruby waited until they were 3 blocks away before asking, "Are you mad at me for wanting to know her?" Garrett reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "No, baby. You're allowed to want to know your grandmother. That's normal and good. But she hurt you during the divorce." "She did. But hurt people, and I think your grandmother has been hurt in ways we're just starting to understand." Ruby absorbed this in silence for several miles, then shifted to face him more directly. "Dad, did you love Mom?" The question caught him unprepared. He navigated the truck through a 4-way stop while buying time to formulate an answer that was honest without being destructive. "I did, very much." "Do you still?" "I love the woman I thought she was, the woman she might have been if things had been different." He paused, "But the real Vanessa, the one who left because I wasn't ambitious enough or rich enough or whatever. Enough I don't know her well enough to love her anymore." "That's sad." "Yeah, it is." They drove the rest of the way in companionable quiet. Garrett pulled into the driveway of the house he'd bought with the divorce settlement money, small 2 bedrooms, but his with no mortgage and no debt. Ruby climbed out and headed inside to shower while Garrett sat in the truck's cab engine, ticking as it cooled, trying to process the evening's impossible sequence of events. His phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. He opened it and felt his stomach drop. The message was from Vanessa. "I know you saw my mother tonight. David has friends at that restaurant. Stay away from her, Garrett. I mean it. She's toxic and I won't have her anywhere near Ruby. If I find out you're involving my daughter with her, my lawyer will be very interested in talking about custody modification." Garrett read it 3 times, anger building with each pass. David Donovan, whatever he called himself, had spies reporting on Garrett's movements. Vanessa, who saw Ruby 4 times a year for photo opportunities, was threatening legal action to prevent the child from knowing her own grandmother. The sheer audacity would have been funny if it weren't terrifying. He typed and deleted 5 responses before settling on, "Ruby has a right to know her family. We'll discuss this like adults when you have time between real estate showings." Vanessa's response came within seconds. "Don't test me. You won't win." Garrett put the phone face down on the passenger seat and closed his eyes. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to back off, apologize to Eleanor tomorrow, and explain he couldn't get involved after all. Vanessa had money and lawyers and leverage. She could make his life hell with a custody battle, drag him through courts he couldn't afford. Weaponize Ruby's need for stability against him. But he kept seeing Eleanor's face when Ruby had called her grandmother. The way hope had flickered to life in eyes that had been dead with resignation. The way Ruby had looked at him for approval before hugging the woman, trusting that Dad wouldn't steer her wrong. Inside the house, water ran through old pipes as Ruby showered. Garrett's phone buzzed again, a voicemail this time from a number he didn't recognize. He played it on speaker, Eleanor's voice shaking but determined. "Garrett, it's Eleanor. I just wanted to say thank you again. What you did tonight, I'll never forget it. But I also want you to know that I understand if you need to step back. Vanessa is my daughter, and I know her when she feels threatened. She'll go after you, and I won't let her hurt you or Ruby on my account. So if you need to pretend tonight didn't happen, I'll understand completely. You've already given me more than I had any right to hope for." The message ended. Garrett sat in his truck as streetlights came on, automatically triggered by sensors that couldn't distinguish between dusk and night. Somewhere in this town, Vanessa was probably strategizing with Donovan about how to neutralize this threat to her carefully constructed narrative. Somewhere else, Eleanor was probably packing boxes for an eviction she couldn't prevent, resigned to homelessness because her daughter had chosen image over truth 3 years ago and never looked back. And here in this driveway, Garrett had to decide which version of himself he wanted to be. The version who protected himself and Ruby by walking away from complications. Or the version who remembered what it felt like to be abandoned and couldn't quite bring himself to do it to someone else. He was still sitting there when Ruby appeared at the truck window. Hair wet from the shower, wearing her pajamas and a concerned expression. She knocked on the glass. He rolled it down. "Dad, are you okay?" "Yeah, baby, just thinking. About grandmother, among other things." Ruby chewed her lower lip, a nervous habit she'd inherited from him. "I liked meeting her. Is that okay?" The question shouldn't have hurt, but did. That she felt the need to ask permission to like her own grandmother to check if basic human connection was allowed. Garrett opened the truck door and pulled Ruby into a hug, her damp hair cold against his neck. "Of course it's okay. You can like whoever you want. Even if it makes Mom mad. Even then." Ruby pulled back to look at him seriously. "Mom's going to be mad, though, right about tonight?" "Probably." "Are you scared?" The honest answer was yes, terrified of courts and lawyers and the possibility of losing custody of Ruby growing up in Donovan Pierce's house. Learning values that contradicted everything Garrett believed in. But fear was a private burden, not one to share with an 11-year-old who already carried too much awareness for her age. "I'm concerned, but I'm more concerned about doing the right thing than about what your mom might do." Ruby processed this, then nodded with the gravity of someone much older. "Okay, I trust you, Dad." They went inside together. Garrett made hot chocolate even though it was too warm for it, and they sat at the kitchen table while Ruby told him about a boy at school who had asked to borrow her eraser 3 times in 1 week. The conversation was deliberately normal, anchoring both of them after an evening that had tilted their world sideways. At 9 o'clock, Garrett tucked Ruby into bed and read 2 chapters of their current book. A fantasy novel about a girl who discovered she could talk to trees. When he closed the book, Ruby asked one more question. "Dad, why did you really help grandmother tonight?" He thought about all the complex answers he could give. About second chances and teaching by example and the impossibility of watching someone drown when you have a rope. About how the divorce had taught him that cruelty compounds but kindness interrupts the cycle if you're brave enough to try. Instead, he gave her the simple truth. Because nobody deserves to sit alone in a restaurant while strangers whisper and judge. And because you were watching, and I wanted you to see that we help people even when it's complicated. Is it going to get more complicated? Probably. I'm glad you helped her anyway. After Ruby fell asleep, Garrett sat in the living room with his phone and laptop researching eviction laws and tenant rights and emergency assistance programs. He drafted an email to Pastor Caleb Morrison explaining the situation and asking about the church's benevolence fund. He created a spreadsheet of Eleanor's expenses as she'd described them. Rent, utilities, groceries, medication, and what it would take to stabilize her situation. At midnight, a new text arrived from an unknown number. He opened it, expecting more threats from Vanessa, and found instead a message that made his blood run cold. "Eleanor, darling, it's Sterling. I'm so sorry about tonight. I had a family emergency. My sister had a heart attack and I had to rush to the hospital. My phone died in the chaos and I couldn't contact you. I feel terrible for leaving you like that. I found your credit cards in my car. They must have fallen out of your purse. I'd love to return them and make this up to you. Perhaps we could try dinner again. I know this wonderful Italian place. Let me know when you're free. I truly hope you can forgive me." Garrett stared at the message ice spreading through his veins. Sterling Bradford, if that was even his real name, was making his move. The playbook was obvious: create crisis, disappear, return, with plausible excuse and stolen items, offer to help, while extracting more access to Eleanor's life and finances. The woman had already lost her savings to one scam. She was vulnerable, desperate, lonely enough that she might believe this obvious lie because the alternative was accepting that she'd been victimized twice in one night. He screenshot the message and ran it through his laptop, searching for the phone number. No results. Burner phone, probably. He tried reverse image searching Sterling's profile picture from what he remembered of the man. Nothing conclusive, but the image appeared on 3 different dating sites under 3 different names. Thomas Brand, Sterling Bradford, Tommy Radford. Garrett created a folder on his desktop and started saving evidence. Screenshots of the dating profiles, the text message, notes about the restaurant incident and the stolen credit cards. If Sterling Bradford was running a scam operation, someone needed to stop him before Eleanor became another victim. At 1 a.m., exhausted but too wired to sleep, Garrett texted Eleanor. "Did you get a message from Sterling, the man from the restaurant?" Her response came within minutes. "Yes, he apologized, said it was a family emergency. He has my credit cards. I think maybe I judged him too harshly." Garrett's jaw clenched. "Eleanor, please don't respond to him yet. Let me look into something first. Promise me you won't meet him or give him any more information." A long pause, then, "Why, what's wrong?" "I think he's running a scam. I found his photo on multiple dating sites under different names. Please just wait until we can talk in person tomorrow." Another pause, longer this time. "Garrett, I appreciate your concern, but I'm 68 years old, not a child. I can evaluate my own relationships." He typed carefully. "I know you can. I'm just asking you to wait 24 hours before making any decisions, that's all." "Fine. 24 hours." Garrett set the phone down and rubbed his eyes until he saw stars. In the space of 6 hours, he'd gone from celebrating Ruby's report card to tangling himself in a web of complications that included his ex-wife's estranged mother, a probable con artist, and threatened legal action. Every rational cell in his body screamed to extricate himself immediately. But he kept thinking about Eleanor sitting in that restaurant counting $8 in cash while strangers whispered. About the way she'd looked at Ruby, starving for connection, willing to believe obvious lies because loneliness made bad judgment seem reasonable. About the man he wanted to be versus the man who took the easy way out. At some point in the small hours, Garrett fell asleep on the couch with his laptop open to eviction law forums. He dreamed of electrical circuits with wires that wouldn't connect properly. No matter how carefully he stripped them, panels that sparked and smoked and refused to carry current breakers that wouldn't trip even when everything was burning. He woke to his phone ringing at 6:30 a.m. Ruby already up and eating cereal in the kitchen. The caller ID showed Pastor Caleb Morrison. Garrett answered with a voice rough from too little sleep. "Caleb." The pastor's voice was gentle but direct. "Garrett, I got your email about Eleanor Whitmore. Before we talk about church assistance, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared for the fallout from helping Vanessa's mother, because people are already talking and not all of them are saying kind things?" Garrett sat up, fully awake now. "What are people saying? That you're dating an older woman, that you're using Eleanor to get back at Vanessa, that you're exposing Ruby to unstable people?" Caleb paused. "I don't believe any of it, but I need to know if you've thought through what this could mean for your business, your reputation, your custody arrangement." "I've thought about it. And..." Garrett looked at Ruby in the kitchen, pouring orange juice with careful concentration. "And I'm going to help her anyway. Because it's the right thing to do, and because I want Ruby to learn that we don't abandon people just because it's convenient." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll support you however I can. But Garrett, be careful. Vanessa has a long reach and a lot of pride. This won't end quietly." "I know. Do you, though?" because from where I'm sitting, you've just painted a target on your back. And the person holding the gun is someone who's already proven she'll shoot to win. The Henderson contract cancellation arrived Monday morning via email while Garrett stood in Miller's hardware parking lot, a spool of Romex wire waiting in his truck bed. The language was corporate polite, unforeseen circumstances, and vendor relationship reassessment. But Mrs. Henderson's personal note cut through the professional distance. My husband heard about you and an older woman at Riverside Grill. He thinks it's drama we don't want near our house. I'm sorry, Garrett. You're a good man, but Harold is adamant. $15,000. Gone. Kevin Marsh, his apprentice, emerged from the hardware store carrying outlet boxes. The kid took one look at Garrett's face and understood without asking. They loaded the truck in silence, organizing materials with the methodical precision that came from working together long enough to communicate through gesture and rhythm. Bad news. Henderson pulled the contract. Kevin's hands paused mid-motion. That was our quarter. What happened? Helping someone at a restaurant counts as drama, apparently. They drove to the Victorian rental on Maple Street where knob and tube wiring needed replacing work that paid hourly but barely covered expenses. Garrett climbed into the attic while Kevin handled first-floor rough-in, both men falling into the rhythm that made electrical work almost meditative. Strip wire connect terminals, secure junction boxes, test circuits. Physics that didn't care about gossip or custody threats or the way helping someone could cost you everything. At 2:15, Kevin's phone rang. He listened, his expression shifting from confused to carefully neutral. When he hung up, he cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. Mrs. Patterson canceled next week's panel upgrade. She heard you're involved in some inappropriate relationship and doesn't feel comfortable having you around her house anymore. 2 contracts in one day. Garrett sat back on his heels doing rapid math. Between Henderson and Patterson, he'd lost nearly 20% of his quarterly income. More concerning was the pattern gossip spreading faster than facts, his business reputation becoming collateral damage in whatever war Vanessa had declared. His phone buzzed. Text from Vanessa. I see you're still involving yourself with my mother. Frank Sutherland will be contacting you this week. Last warning. Another text, this one from Eleanor. Sterling messaged again. He seems genuinely sorry. Would it be terrible to give him one more chance to return my credit cards? Garrett called Eleanor before he could second-guess it. She answered tentatively, her voice suggesting she knew a lecture was coming. Eleanor, I researched Sterling Bradford. That's not his real name. Same photo appears on 3 dating sites under different names. Thomas Brand, Tommy, Radford. Sterling Bradford. I found a police report from Cleveland. He convinced a woman named Patricia Simmons to give him bank access for her daughter's medical bills. Withdrew $43,000 over 6 weeks. She was evicted from her nursing home. The silence lasted long enough that Garrett checked if the call had dropped. Eleanor's voice came back smaller. $43,000, oh God. He's a professional. The emergency excuse, the found credit cards, another dinner invitation, it's designed to make you trust him so he can finish what he started. But I don't have $43,000, I have nothing. You have a social security number, bank account access, credit you haven't maxed, and you have something else he's counting on. You're lonely enough to want to believe him. The admission hung between them like a confession. Eleanor made a sound that was half laugh, half breaking. I wanted so badly to believe someone could want my company that I ignored every warning. I'm 68 and still capable of being a complete fool. You're human. There's a difference. Garrett switched the phone to his other ear. Promise me you won't respond to Sterling. Don't meet him. Don't give him anything. Let me handle this. Handle it how? I'm calling Detective Logan Barnes. If Sterling is running the scam I think he is, Logan will want to know. After they disconnected, Garrett left a detailed voicemail for Barnes about the fraud pattern he'd uncovered. Then he returned to work, grateful for problems that had solutions involving wire strippers and voltage testers rather than lawyers and custody battles. Pastor Caleb called at 4, requesting a meeting at the church office. Garrett arrived to find the pastor behind his ancient desk, reading glasses perched on his nose, wearing the expression of someone who'd spent the morning mediating conflicts he hadn't created. The Benevolence Fund Committee met this morning about your request for Eleanor. Vote was 3 in favor, 4 against. The news landed like a physical blow. Let me guess, the against votes think I'm having an affair with my ex-wife's mother. Caleb's expression confirmed it. Harold and Patricia Henderson were vocal about their concerns. They believe you're demonstrating poor judgment by involving yourself with someone who has a history of instability. Their words: Eleanor isn't unstable. She's lonely and poor and being targeted by a con artist. Half the congregation thinks you're a good Samaritan being persecuted. The other half thinks you've lost perspective and are risking Ruby's stability for a woman you barely know. Caleb removed his glasses. Vanessa called me this morning, asked if you'd been bringing Eleanor around Ruby, if I'd observed behavior suggesting poor judgment. She informed me her lawyer would be filing a custody modification by week's end. Garrett's hands clenched involuntarily. She sees Ruby 4 times a year, forgot her birthday last April, canceled Christmas because Donovan wanted Aspen, and now she wants custody. She wants control. You helping Eleanor threatens her narrative, proves she's capable of cruelty her mother doesn't deserve, suggests abandoning you was flawed judgment. She can't allow that story to exist. The assessment hurt with its accuracy. Garrett had spent 8 years building life around Ruby that worked because Vanessa remained peripheral. Now that stability was threatened not by changed parenting but by refusing to let an old woman suffer alone. Detective Barnes called that evening while Garrett helped Ruby with algebra. He stepped into the living room to take it. Sullivan, I did some digging on Sterling Bradford. We've been tracking this guy 8 months across 3 counties. At least 12 victims we know about. Total documented losses around 200,000. Garrett's stomach turned. What do you need? Everything you've got: screenshots, text, documentation. If Eleanor files a complaint about the stolen cards, that gives us grounds to bring him in. We think he's working with a partner handling identity theft while he focuses on romance scams. Barnes paused. One more thing, if Eleanor's willing to wear a wire, we could set up a controlled meeting and catch him in the act. Clean arrest. Garrett imagined Eleanor across from Sterling with cops listening, vulnerable and exposed. I'll ask her, but no pressure if she's not comfortable. He texted Eleanor requesting all communications with Sterling. Her response came within minutes, forwarded messages that painted methodical grooming. Compliments about her smile, intelligence, strength. Questions that seemed caring but were actually intelligence gathering. Ruby appeared in the doorway, empty milk glass in hand. Dad, is everything okay? You look stressed. He pulled her into a side hug. Just work stuff. Is it about grandmother Eleanor? Are people being mean because you helped her? The directness derailed his prepared deflection. Some are, but that doesn't mean helping was wrong. Kayla Patterson said her mom canceled a job with you. Is that true? Yeah, baby, that's true. That's stupid. You were just being nice. Sometimes being nice has consequences we don't expect. He studied her face, gauging impact. Are kids giving you a hard time at school? Ruby shrugged with elaborate casualness. Some, mostly dumb stuff. Ms. Thornton made them stop. The formal letter from Frank Sutherland arrived Wednesday via certified mail, embossed letterhead, announcing credentials, measured language threatening action. Concerns about Ruby's exposure to unstable individuals. Questions about Garrett's judgment notification that Vanessa Sullivan Pierce would file for custody modification by Friday. Garrett read it in his truck before a simple outlet replacement that would pay $75. The math wasn't working. Expenses exceeded income by margins that would become unsustainable within months if contracts kept evaporating. Eleanor called as he pulled into the client's driveway. Detective Barnes visited this morning. He wants me to file a complaint about Sterling and asked if I'd wear a recording device at a meeting. Her voice shook. I don't know if I'm brave enough. You don't have to do anything uncomfortable. But if you help catch him, you'd protect other women from what he tried with you. Long silence. I'll think about it. I found a boarding house room, 300 monthly shared bathroom, no kitchen. I can move Saturday, avoid formal eviction. Relief flooded her voice despite the reality that a retired teacher would live in a boarding house because her pension wasn't enough for basic housing. That's good. Do you need help moving? I don't have much, but Ruby mentioned she'd like to visit after I'm settled. Would that be okay? Eleanor Vanessa is filing for custody modification. Her lawyer will argue my judgment is impaired because I'm involving Ruby with you. They'll paint you as unstable or dangerous. Then maybe I should stay away. If my presence costs you custody, no. The word came out harder than intended. I'm not abandoning you because Vanessa weaponizes your relationship with Ruby. That's the manipulation she's counting on. I won't teach Ruby that lesson. You could lose her. I could. But Ruby would learn her father doesn't fold under pressure when someone needs help. That seems worth the risk. Thursday morning brought a call from Maeve Thornton 15 minutes before school started. Mr. Sullivan, there's a field trip today to Millbrook Nature Preserve. You're listed as emergency contact, but you're scheduled at a job site an hour away. Eleanor Whitmore is approved in Ruby's file. Would it be okay if she chaperoned? We could use an extra adult. Ruby appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack already on. Is that Miss Thornton? He covered the microphone. Field trip today. She's asking if grandmother Eleanor can chaperone. Ruby's face lit up. Really? That would be awesome. Maeve, yes. Eleanor can chaperone. I'll make sure she's available. Eleanor agreed immediately, something close to joy in her voice. I'd love to. I haven't been on a field trip since I retired. At 11:30, Maeve called back. Panic replaced her usual calm. Mr. Sullivan, there's been an incident. Ruby had an allergic reaction to a bee sting. We called an ambulance. Eleanor administered an EpiPen in Ruby's stable, but we're transporting to County General. Can you meet us? The words allergic reaction and ambulance canceled all other input. Garrett was moving before thought, engaged, climbing down from the ceiling, grabbing keys, yelling emergency to Kevin. 23 minutes to County General felt like hours. He found them in pediatric emergency, Ruby on a bed with monitors, Eleanor beside her holding her hand. Maeve talking to a nurse. Ruby looked small and scared but alert. Face flushed but breathing normal. Relief made Garrett's knees weak. He crossed and pulled Ruby into two tight hugs. Are you okay? What happened? Ruby's voice came muffled against his shoulder. A bee stung my arm and my throat felt weird and I couldn't breathe. Grandmother Eleanor had an EpiPen and knew exactly what to do. Garrett looked at Eleanor, crying silently, hands shaking now that crisis had passed. I saw Ruby's allergy on the medical forms. I brought an EpiPen just in case. 40 years teaching, I learned to prepare for emergencies. Her voice broke. I'm so sorry. I should have watched her more carefully. You saved her life. He said it firmly enough to stop her mid-apology. If you hadn't been there with that EpiPen, this could have been so much worse. The doctor came, young, competent, reassuring. Ruby's vital, stable reaction contained by Eleanor's quick intervention observation for 2 hours to ensure no secondary complications. Maeve approached Garrett. I've never seen someone react that calmly under pressure. Eleanor didn't hesitate, recognized symptoms, administered the EpiPen, perfectly kept Ruby calm. Most chaperones would have panicked. At 2:15, Vanessa arrived like a storm front, Donovan trailing behind. She spotted Ruby and her face cycled through relief and fury before settling on cold rage directed at Eleanor. "What the hell are you doing here? Get away from my daughter!" Ruby went pale. Eleanor stepped back from the bed as if slapped hands rising in surrender or defense. Garrett positioned himself between them, voice low and firm. "Vanessa, not here. Not now. Don't tell me when I can protect my child. You let that woman around Ruby unsupervised, and now my daughter is in the hospital." Eleanor saved Ruby's life. She had an EpiPen ready when Ruby had anaphylaxis. If she hadn't been there, we'd be having a very different conversation. The information derailed Vanessa's momentum briefly. "That doesn't change you involving my unstable mother in Ruby's life against my explicit wishes. Frank is filing tomorrow, and this incident goes straight into documentation." Donovan touched her arm gently. "Vanessa, maybe." She shook him off. "I warned Garrett. He ignored me. Now he deals with consequences." Eleanor's voice cut through tension, quiet but clear. "Vanessa, please. Don't punish Garrett or Ruby because of anger at me. I'm the one you're mad at." "There's nothing to handle, Mother. I told you 3 years ago we were done. You inserted yourself through Garrett, and now you'll learn why I cut you off. Vanessa, Garrett helped because I was being scammed, about to be evicted, alone and desperate. That wasn't manipulation, it was human decency." "Human decency? Is that what you call trying to sabotage my marriage? Making me choose between my mother and my husband? I called it telling truth. Donovan had qualities I thought you should know about before permanent decisions. You were jealous that I had the life you never could, that I married someone successful instead of settling for a carpenter who worked himself to death for a pension barely covering your rent." The cruelty landed physically. Eleanor swayed. Donovan had gone still, expression unreadable. Garrett's voice came colder than intended. "Vanessa, Ruby is 10 feet away, hearing every word. If you want to file for custody, go ahead. But you will not verbally abuse Eleanor in front of our daughter." "Our daughter? You mean my daughter you're using as a prop to play white knight for a woman you barely know? How long have you been planning this revenge through my mother? I saw an old woman abandoned at a restaurant and chose to help. There's no conspiracy, just basic human compassion, which I know is foreign to you." The doctor reappeared, expression professional but firm. "I need you to take this elsewhere." Vanessa ignored her, stepping closer to Garrett. "You think you're teaching Ruby noble lessons about kindness? You're teaching her it's okay to prioritize strangers over family stability. I'm teaching her people matter more than comfort, that we help those who need it even when it costs something. And yes, I'm teaching her her father doesn't fold when threatened for doing what's right." Ruby's small voice interrupted. "Stop. Both of you just stop." Every adult turned. She sat up in the hospital bed, monitors still attached, face blotchy but voice steady with clarity beyond her years. "Mom, Grandmother Eleanor saved me. I couldn't breathe and she helped and stayed with me. Dad's trying to help because she was alone and sad. Nobody's using me or trying to hurt anybody. You're both just being mean like always." The assessment hit with force of truth delivered by someone too young for diplomacy. Vanessa flushed. Garrett felt shame heat his neck. Vanessa turned and walked out without another word. Donovan hesitated, looking at Eleanor with something like apology, then followed. The doctor returned with discharge papers. Garrett signed mechanically, mind processing the confrontation, and Ruby's intervention and Eleanor's face when Vanessa spoke of her dead husband with casual contempt. In the parking lot, Eleanor stopped before saying goodbye. "I'm sorry you had to see that, sweetheart. Your mother and I have complicated history. We shouldn't have argued in front of you." Ruby hugged her without hesitation. "It's okay, grandmother. I'm glad you were there." In the truck, Ruby waited 3 blocks before asking, "Are you mad at me for wanting to know her?" "No, baby. Wanting to know your grandmother is normal and good." "But she hurt you during the divorce." "She did. But hurt people hurt people. I think your grandmother has been hurt in ways we're just starting to understand." Silence for several miles. Then Ruby shifted to face him. "Dad, are you going to lose custody of me?" The question deserved honesty. "I don't know. Your mom is going to try. But I'm going to fight, and I'm going to keep being your dad regardless of what any court says." "Because you helped grandmother Eleanor?" "Because I helped her and your mom sees that as threatening the story she tells about why she left us." He squeezed her shoulder. "But even if it costs something, helping Eleanor was still right. You understand that?" Ruby nodded slowly. "I think so. It's like you say, doing what's right isn't always easy, but you can live with yourself after." His father's words in his daughter's voice. The continuity made Garrett's throat tight. That night, after Ruby slept, Eleanor called at 10:30, apologetic for the late hour. "Detective Barnes came by. I agreed to help with the Sterling sting. They're setting it up for Saturday. I'll meet him at a restaurant wearing a wire. They'll arrest him when he makes his move." "Are you sure it's going to be stressful?" "I'm sure. You've risked so much helping me. The least I can do is help catch the man trying to victimize me and dozens of others." She paused. "After today, would it be easier if I stepped back?" "Stopped seeing Ruby. I don't want to be." "Why you lose custody?" "Eleanor backing off now wouldn't change anything. Vanessa already filed. Walking away would just prove her manipulation works." "I won't teach Ruby that lesson, even if it costs custody." "You're better than I deserve. I'm just trying to do a little better than yesterday." Sunday brought Pastor Caleb's call with news that lifted some weight. The congregation had taken informal collection after hearing about Ruby's hospital visit and Eleanor's role. $3,000, enough to cover Eleanor's first months in the boarding house and give her breathing room. "Maeve Thornton organized it," Caleb explained. "Told the story at Wednesday's service. People responded. The Hendersons even contributed their way of apologizing without admitting they were wrong." Garrett called Eleanor immediately. She cried, which he expected. What surprised him was her next question. "Can I use some to buy Ruby a birthday present? I missed 11 of them. I'd like to start making up for that. This money is for you, for housing and stability. What good is stability if I can't share it with people who matter? Let me be a grandmother in more than name." Sunday afternoon's meeting with Jennifer Park, the custody lawyer he could almost afford, lasted 2 hours. She was direct about challenges. Vanessa had money and high-powered attorney. Public perception was divided. Judges sometimes defaulted to mothers. But confident about strengths, Ruby's age and preferences carried weight. Garrett's stability was well documented. Eleanor's hospital heroism undermined any unstable influence narrative. "The key is framing," Jennifer explained. "Vanessa argues poor judgment. We argue strong values taught through action. She says Eleanor is unstable. We say devoted grandmother who saved Ruby's life. She claims you prioritize strangers over welfare. We show helping Eleanor taught Ruby compassion in action." Realistic chances. Jennifer set down her pen with requested honesty. 60-40 in your favor if Ruby testifies well and we present right witnesses, assuming Vanessa doesn't pull surprises, which wealthy litigants always do. That night, Garrett and Ruby sat on the back porch watching fireflies. She'd been quiet since helping Eleanor organize the boarding house room that afternoon. "Dad, if you lose custody because you helped grandmother Eleanor, will you regret it?" The question deserved more than reflexive answer. Garrett thought about Eleanor's face when Ruby hugged her in the hospital. About Sterling Bradford in custody, unable to victimize more women. About the lesson Ruby was learning about valuing people above convenience. No, baby, I won't regret it. Because even if worst happens, I'll know I taught you something more important than winning. That we stand up for people who need us even when it costs something. That's who I want you to be. The only way to teach it is to live it. Ruby leaned against his shoulder, small and warm and trusting. I think Grandmother Eleanor is lucky to have you as her friend. I think we're lucky to have her as family. They sat in companionable silence while fireflies danced and first stars emerged. Somewhere across town, Vanessa prepared for a custody battle that would determine whether love and stability could outweigh money and manipulation. Garrett didn't know how the hearing would go, didn't know if Ruby's preferences would be honored, didn't know if Jennifer Park was as good as reputation suggested. What he knew, he'd made the choice he could live with, had helped someone who needed it despite cost, had taught his daughter through action that compassion wasn't conditional, and people weren't disposable. In 3 weeks, a judge would decide if that was enough. Until then, Garrett would keep showing up, keep working, keep being the father Ruby deserved and the friend Eleanor needed. The fireflies continued their dance. Ruby fell asleep against his shoulder. And Garrett sat in gathering darkness, holding his daughter close, preparing for battle ahead while hoping desperately that doing right would be enough to let them keep doing it together. The 3 weeks before the custody hearing contracted and expanded simultaneously, days crawling past in anxiety-soaked increments, while the calendar pages flipped with terrifying velocity. Garrett spent mornings on job sites, running wire through walls, and evenings at his kitchen table with Jennifer Park rehearsing testimony until the words felt simultaneously over-practiced and inadequate. Pastor Caleb stopped by on a Wednesday evening uninvited, but welcome, carrying a casserole his wife had made, and the kind of pastoral presence that didn't require explanation. They sat at the kitchen table while Ruby did homework in her room, the casserole cooling between them. How are you holding up? Caleb's voice carried the gentleness of someone who'd walked dozens of people through crises and knew the difference between performing strength and actually possessing it. Some days I'm fine. Some days I can't breathe thinking about Ruby living with Vanessa full time. Garrett pushed food around his plate without eating. Jennifer thinks we have good odds, but good odds still means there's a chance I lose. You did the right thing helping Eleanor. Whatever happens in that courtroom doesn't change that. Doesn't it? If doing right costs me my daughter, what does that say about the universe's sense of justice? Caleb was quiet for a moment, choosing words with care. It says the universe doesn't guarantee fair outcomes for moral choices. It also says you're raising a daughter who watched her father choose integrity over safety. That lesson will stay with Ruby regardless of which house she sleeps in. The reassurance felt hollow despite its truth. Garrett wanted both, wanted to keep Ruby and wanted her to learn that compassion mattered more than convenience. The possibility of achieving only one felt like failing at the only test that actually counted. Eleanor called after Caleb, left her voice thin with exhaustion that came from more than just the late hour. Garrett, I've been thinking. I could testify that you barely know me, that our relationship isn't as close as Vanessa claims. It might help your case if the judge thinks I'm not really part of Ruby's life. Eleanor, no. We're not building our defense on lies. It wouldn't be lying exactly, just emphasizing distance over connection. For Ruby's sake. Ruby's sake is exactly why we tell the truth. She needs to see that doing right doesn't require apologizing or hiding or pretending things are other than they are. He softened his voice. You saved her life. You're her grandmother. Those facts don't change because they're inconvenient for Vanessa's narrative. I'm scared, Garrett. Scared that helping you will hurt you worse. scared that Vanessa will destroy you because of me. Then we'll be scared together, but we won't lie. The morning of the hearing arrived with unseasonable cold October, pretending to be November with frost coating the grass and breath visible in the early light. Garrett dressed carefully, the one suit he owned purchased for his father's funeral 9 years ago, and worn only for weddings and court dates since. Ruby appeared at his bedroom door while he struggled with the tie, her own outfit chosen with similar care. "Let me." She stepped forward and adjusted the knot with competence that surprised him until he remembered Vanessa had probably taught her during one of those brief visits when she'd cared about appearances. "You don't have to testify if you don't want to." Garrett watched her face in the mirror as she worked. "Judge Richardson will talk to you, but you can tell her you're not comfortable." "I want to. I want to tell her I choose you." The simplicity of it, "I choose you," hit somewhere beneath his ribs, where fear and love tangled into knots no electrician could unravel. County Courthouse occupied a limestone building from the 1930s, all marble floors and acoustic tiles that made every footstep echo with institutional permanence. Jennifer Park met them outside courtroom 3B, her briefcase organized and her expression projecting confidence Garrett wished he felt. Eleanor arrived separately, dressed in navy again, her hands trembling despite obvious efforts at composure. Frank Sutherland stood near the plaintiff's table, 50-something and expensive in the way of lawyers who charged by the quarter hour. Vanessa sat beside him, looking polished and wounded, an expression Garrett recognized from their marriage, as the face she wore when reality refused to match her preferred narrative. Donovan occupied the seat behind her, present but somehow separate, his body language suggesting obligation rather than support. Judge Richardson entered, a woman in her mid-50s with gray hair and the particular brand of stern patience that came from presiding over family court where everyone believed themselves the injured party. She reviewed her notes briefly before addressing the assembled parties. "We're here regarding a petition for custody modification filed by Vanessa Sullivan Pierce concerning the minor child Ruby Sullivan, currently in the primary custody of Garrett Sullivan. Mr. Sutherland, you may proceed with your opening statement." Frank Sutherland stood with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about a child's welfare being compromised by her father's increasingly erratic judgment. Over the past month, Mr. Sullivan has involved Ruby with Eleanor Whitmore, a woman with documented mental health struggles and financial instability, despite knowing this relationship distressed his daughter and created an unsafe environment. Mrs. Sullivan Pierce seeks custody modification not from vindictiveness, but from genuine concern that Ruby's father is prioritizing his own emotional needs over her stability." Jennifer Park's response came measured and firm. "Your Honor, this case is about a dedicated father who demonstrated to his daughter that compassion matters more than convenience. Mr. Sullivan helped a woman in crisis, his ex-wife's estranged mother, and in doing so, taught Ruby that we don't abandon people when helping them becomes complicated. The petitioner seeks to weaponize basic human decency and paint it as poor judgment, because it exposes her own failures as a mother and daughter." Judge Richardson made notes on her legal pad, expression neutral. "Mr. Sutherland, call your first witness." Vanessa took the stand with the composure of someone who'd rehearsed this moment until spontaneity became performance. Frank Sutherland guided her through preliminary questions, her relationship with Ruby, her career success, her marriage to Donovan Pierce, and the stable home they could provide. "Mrs. Sullivan Pierce, when did you first become aware that your ex-husband was involving Ruby with your mother, Eleanor Whitmore?" 3 weeks ago, I received a call from a friend who'd seen them together at Riverside Grill. I was shocked, because I'd made it explicitly clear to Garrett that my mother was not a healthy influence. She has a history of enabling destructive behavior, and I'd cut contact with her for Ruby's protection. What steps did you take when you learned about this contact? I called Garrett immediately and asked him to stop. Explained that exposing Ruby to my mother's instability could damage her emotionally. He refused and became defensive, which made me realize his judgment was more impaired than I'd thought. Jennifer Park stood for cross-examination, her approach surgical rather than aggressive. Mrs. Sullivan Pierce, how many times did you see Ruby in the past year? Vanessa's composure flickered. I'm not sure of the exact number. My work schedule is demanding, and would it surprise you to learn from Ruby's school records that you attended 0 parent-teacher conferences, 0 school events, and visited her exactly 3 times for a total of 9 hours? My career requires... When is Ruby's birthday? The pause lasted too long. April. April what? The 15th. Close, it's April 17th. What's her teacher's name? I don't see how. Your Honor, the witness has petitioned for primary custody of a child whose birthday she doesn't know and whose teacher she can't name. I think these questions are quite relevant to her claims about prioritizing Ruby's welfare. Judge Richardson nodded. Answer the question, Mrs. Sullivan Pierce. I don't recall her teacher's name at the moment. That doesn't mean I don't care about my daughter's education. Jennifer continued without mercy. You mentioned Eleanor Whitmore's instability. Are you aware that 3 weeks ago your mother saved Ruby's life by administering an EpiPen when Ruby had an anaphylactic reaction to a bee sting? Vanessa's face flushed. I'm aware there was an incident, yes. That doesn't negate her overall. The hospital staff called it a textbook emergency response. Eleanor Whitmore had brought an EpiPen specifically because she'd read Ruby's medical forms and wanted to be prepared. When did you last review Ruby's medical records? The silence provided its own answer. Garrett took the stand next, his hands steady despite the nausea churning in his stomach. Jennifer Park walked him through the routine of his days, with Ruby breakfast together every morning, homework help every evening, bedtime reading without exception. The job sites and tight budgets, and the way he'd built an entire life around being present for someone who needed him to show up. Mr. Sullivan, why did you help Eleanor Whitmore despite knowing it might complicate your custody arrangement? Garrett looked at Ruby sitting beside Eleanor in the gallery, her face anxious but trusting. Because my daughter was watching, and I wanted her to learn that people matter more than convenience. Eleanor was abandoned at a restaurant alone and humiliated, and Ruby asked me if we could help. What kind of lesson would I have taught if I'd said no just because it was her grandmother instead of a stranger? Mrs. Sullivan Pierce's counsel suggests you demonstrated poor judgment in involving Ruby with someone you barely knew. I've known Eleanor for 8 years. She was my mother-in-law during my marriage. I knew she was a retired teacher who'd devoted 40 years to helping children learn. I knew she'd been cut off by her daughter for telling uncomfortable truths. And I knew Ruby deserved the chance to have a grandmother who actually wanted to be part of her life. Jennifer let the answer settle before continuing. What does Ruby need most from a parent? Garrett didn't hesitate. Ruby doesn't need wealth or a bigger house or private schools. She needs someone who shows up, who knows her favorite book and her greatest fear and which math concepts make her cry with frustration. She needs presence, not presence. She needs a parent who loves her more than they love their own comfort. The words landed with force that made Vanessa flinch. Frank Sutherland's cross-examination tried to paint Garrett as financially unstable, professionally unreliable, emotionally compromised by his connection to Eleanor. But each attack created openings for Garrett to explain choices that prioritized Ruby over profit, integrity over image, relationship over reputation. Eleanor took the stand with visible reluctance, her hands gripping the armrests as she settled into the witness chair. Jennifer Park approached with gentleness that acknowledged the vulnerability of someone testifying against their own should. Mrs. Whitmore, you're Vanessa Sullivan Pierce's mother, correct? Yes. Can you describe your relationship with your daughter? Eleanor's voice came out steady despite the moisture gathering in her eyes. We haven't spoken in 3 years. I told her some truths about her husband that she didn't want to hear, and she cut me out of her life completely. No phone calls, no visits, no contact with Ruby, my granddaughter I'd never met. Why did you try to share those concerns about Donovan Pierce? Because I'd seen him be cruel to service workers, heard him talk about people as if their value came entirely from their bank accounts. I loved my daughter enough to risk our relationship by telling her I thought she'd made a mistake choosing him over Garrett. What happened when Garrett Sullivan helped you at Riverside Grill? Eleanor's composure cracked slightly. He saved me from the worst humiliation of my life. I'd been scammed by a man I'd trusted, left alone at a restaurant with a bill I couldn't pay. And Garrett, the man I'd wronged 8 years ago by staying silent during his divorce, he chose kindness anyway. He paid the bill, drove me home, and when he discovered I was facing eviction, he didn't walk away. He stayed. Jennifer paused to let the testimony breathe. Mrs. Whitmore, you heard your daughter's testimony that you have mental health struggles and represent an unsafe influence for Ruby. How do you respond to that characterization? I had depression after my husband died 5 years ago. I saw a therapist, took medication, did the work to heal. Having experienced grief and gotten help for it doesn't make me dangerous, it makes me human. Eleanor's voice strengthened. What's dangerous is teaching a child that people become disposable when they're inconvenient, that compassion is conditional, that we abandon family members when they struggle. What kind of father do you believe Garrett Sullivan is? Eleanor turned to look directly at Garrett, tears now falling without restraint. Garrett Sullivan is the kind of man who shows mercy to someone who wronged him, who chooses integrity when it costs him everything, who teaches his daughter through actions rather than lectures that character matters more than comfort. Her voice broke, but she continued. A man who can forgive like that, who can look past his own pain to see someone else's suffering, that's exactly the kind of man who should raise my granddaughter. He's a better person than I was, and Ruby is lucky to have him. The courtroom went silent. Even Frank Sutherland seemed momentarily uncertain how to counter testimony that combined confession and vindication in equal measure. Ruby's turn came after lunch recess. Judge Richardson called her into chambers rather than making her testify in open court, but Jennifer had prepared Garrett for this possibility. Through the closed door, he could only imagine the conversation, Richardson asking gentle questions, while Ruby tried to articulate feelings too complex for an 11-year-old vocabulary. When they emerged 20 minutes later, Ruby's face was red from crying, but her expression suggested relief rather than trauma. She returned to her seat beside Eleanor without looking at Vanessa. The final witness surprised everyone. Donovan Pierce took the stand despite not being called by either attorney, requesting permission to address the court directly. Judge Richardson allowed it with obvious curiosity. Mr. Pierce, you're Vanessa Sullivan Pierce's husband. For the moment, I filed for divorce yesterday. The admission created immediate commotion. Vanessa half stood from her seat before Frank Sutherland pulled her back down. Donovan continued without acknowledging her. I can't participate in this anymore. Your Honor, my wife doesn't want custody because she loves Ruby or believes she can provide better care. She wants custody because she can't tolerate the idea that Garrett Sullivan might be a better person than she gave him credit for. Frank Sutherland objected immediately, but Judge Richardson overruled him. I'll allow it. Mr. Pierce, continue. Ruby has come to our house maybe 4 times this year. Each visit lasted less than 3 hours. Vanessa staged photos for social media, then essentially ignored Ruby while she worked or shopped or did anything except actually parent. I've watched Garrett from a distance. Vanessa asked me to gather information for this case. All I saw was a man who puts his daughter first in everything. He's not perfect, but he's present. That's more than Vanessa has ever been. Why are you testifying against your wife's custody petition? Donovan met Vanessa's furious gaze without flinching. Because I've spent 8 years watching her build a life based on image rather than substance. I enabled it, participated in it, benefited from it. But I won't lie under oath to help her take a child away from the parent who actually loves her unconditionally. Judge Richardson called a 15-minute recess before delivering her decision. Garrett stood in the hallway with Eleanor and Ruby Jennifer Park, reviewing notes nearby, all of them suspended in the terrible limbo of waiting for someone else to determine their future. Ruby leaned against Garrett's side. What did you tell Judge Richardson? He kept his voice low. That you're the best dad anyone could have. That you help me with homework and read with me every night and know all my favorite things. That Mom is nice when she visits, but she doesn't really know me. Ruby looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding. Was that okay to say? That was perfect, baby. That was just telling the truth. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Richardson had completed her notes and wore the expression of someone who'd reached a difficult decision with confidence in its correctness. I've reviewed all testimony and evidence submitted by both parties. This court's primary concern is the welfare of the minor child, Ruby Sullivan, and all decisions must reflect her best interests rather than parental preferences. She paused, looking first at Vanessa, then at Garrett. Primary physical custody will remain with Garrett Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan has demonstrated consistent involvement in Ruby's daily life, appropriate judgment in emergency situations, and values that prioritize his daughter's emotional and developmental needs above his own comfort. Garrett felt his knees go weak with relief so intense it bordered on pain. Ruby grabbed his hand and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Judge Richardson continued without mercy for Vanessa's stricken expression. Visitation for Vanessa Sullivan Pierce will be modified to supervised visits bi-weekly until such time as she can demonstrate sustained interest in Ruby's actual welfare rather than custody as a symbolic victory. Mrs. Pierce will be required to complete a parenting course and family counseling before unsupervised visitation resumes. Additionally, Eleanor Whitmore is hereby approved as an authorized caregiver and emergency contact for Ruby Sullivan. The evidence shows Mrs. Whitmore acted with appropriate judgment during a medical crisis and has established a healthy relationship with her granddaughter. Finally, given the frivolous nature of this petition and the evidence of its retaliatory motivation, Vanessa Sullivan Pierce will be responsible for Garrett Sullivan's legal fees. This court will not reward attempts to weaponize custody arrangements against parents who demonstrate exactly the kind of compassion and integrity we hope to see modeled for children. The gavel fell. Garrett pulled Ruby into a hug while she cried against his shoulder. Eleanor sat motionless in her seat, hands pressed to her mouth, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jennifer Park gathered her materials with professional satisfaction, already moving mentally to her next case. Vanessa remained frozen at the plaintiff's table, her carefully constructed facade cracking visibly. Donovan had already left the courtroom. Frank Sutherland spoke to her in low, urgent tones, but she didn't appear to hear him. In the hallway outside, Eleanor approached Vanessa while Garrett signed paperwork with Jennifer. The conversation was too quiet to overhear, but body language told the story, Eleanor gentle and tentative. Vanessa rigid with fury that gradually collapsed into something more complicated. Grief, maybe. Recognition of loss that extended beyond this courtroom defeat. They spoke for 10 minutes before Vanessa turned and walked away without response. Eleanor returned to Garrett and Ruby with red eyes but something like peace in her expression. "What did you tell her?" Garrett watched Vanessa's retreating figure, that I'd forgive her when she was ready to be forgiven, that she could hate me or use me or ignore me, but I wouldn't stop being her mother. That therapy exists if she ever wants to try healing instead of hiding. Eleanor wiped her eyes. I don't know if she heard me, but I needed to say it anyway. 6 months transformed crisis into routine with the slow accretion of ordinary days. Garrett's business recovered as gossip faded, and clients remembered they needed electricians more than they needed to enforce social judgments. Eleanor's boarding house room became home with the addition of photographs and books, and the small accumulations that marked a space as lived in, rather than merely occupied. Ruby saw her grandmother 3 afternoons a week, the relationship deepening through homework help and baking experiments and conversations about everything and nothing. Vanessa attended her court-mandated parenting course and began supervised visits with Ruby every other Saturday. Interactions that were awkward but gradually less hostile. Ruby's 12th birthday fell on a Thursday in late April, unseasonably warm, with crabapple blossoms already dropping their petals across Garrett's small yard. He'd planned a simple gathering backyard barbecue. Ruby's friends from school, Pastor Caleb and some congregation members who'd supported them through the custody battle. Eleanor arrived early to help with preparations, comfortable now in this space that had become extension of her limited world. She'd made a cake chocolate with vanilla frosting, Ruby's favorite, and carried it with the careful precision of someone who understood that small gestures carried weight beyond their material form. At 2:30, an unfamiliar car pulled into the driveway. Vanessa emerged looking uncertain in a way Garrett had never seen during their marriage. She carried a wrapped present and the tentative posture of someone entering territory where welcome wasn't guaranteed. Ruby spotted her through the kitchen window and went still. "Mom's here." Eleanor touched her granddaughter's shoulder gently. "That's good, sweetheart. You wanted her to come, remember?" "I know. I just didn't think she actually would." Garrett met Vanessa in the driveway, prepared for confrontation or awkwardness. Instead, she offered a small, genuine smile that looked unpracticed. "Thank you for inviting me. I know it couldn't have been easy after everything. Ruby wanted you here. That's what matters." They walked to the backyard together where guests had already begun gathering. Ruby approached her mother cautiously, received a hug that lasted longer than usual. Accepted the birthday present with mumbled thanks. The interaction had rough edges but lacked the performative quality that had characterized Vanessa's previous visits. Throughout the afternoon, Garrett watched Vanessa navigate the party with visible effort, actually talking to Ruby about school rather than staging photos, helping Eleanor serve cake, thanking Pastor Caleb for his support during her mandated counseling. The transformation wasn't complete, but the trajectory suggested genuine attempt rather than strategic performance. As the sun angled toward evening and guests began departing, the 4 of them, Garrett, Ruby, Eleanor, and Vanessa, ended up at the picnic table together. Conversation started haltingly but found rhythm through their shared connection to Ruby and mutual commitment to making her birthday pleasant despite complicated history. Vanessa broke the comfortable silence first. "Garrett, I owe you an apology. Several, actually, but one specifically. You were right about Donovan, about a lot of things. I spent 8 years being angry at you for not being ambitious enough when the real problem was I'd confused wealth with worth." The admission cost her something visible. Garrett met her eyes and found genuine remorse there rather than tactical positioning. "I appreciate you saying that. For what it's worth, I hope your counseling is helping." "It is, painfully. My therapist keeps pointing out that I've spent my whole adult life building an image instead of a life, that I drove away everyone who actually cared about me because they threatened the story I wanted to tell about myself." Vanessa glanced at Eleanor, who'd gone very still. including my mother, who was right about everything and got punished for her honesty. Eleanor's voice came out thick with emotion. Vanessa, I'm not ready yet, Mom. I'm working on it, but I'm not ready to. Vanessa stopped, visibly gathering herself. Can we take this slowly? I want to heal, but I don't know how to do it quickly. Slowly is fine. Slowly is perfect. I'll take whatever pace you can manage. Ruby had been watching the adults with the careful attention of someone who understood she was witnessing something significant. Does this mean we can all have dinner together sometimes, like a family? Vanessa's laugh came out wet. I think we're still figuring out what kind of family we are, baby. But yes, I'd like that, if your dad and grandmother are willing. Garrett looked at Eleanor, who nodded through tears. We're willing. 2 weeks later, Garrett took Ruby and Eleanor to Riverside Grill for dinner, a deliberate choice to return to the restaurant where everything had started. They requested the same booth where Eleanor had sat alone that October night, waiting for a man who'd never return. The waitress who'd witnessed Eleanor's humiliation 6 months ago recognized them and smiled with genuine warmth. It's good to see you folks. What can I get you? They ordered simply burgers and fries and milkshakes that Ruby insisted were essential despite having already eaten dinner. While they waited for food, Vanessa appeared at their table, tentative but present. I got your text about being here. Mind if I join you? Garrett slid over to make room. Ruby beamed with uncomplicated joy at seeing her mother. Eleanor nodded welcome, though her hands trembled slightly as they had that first night. The conversation flowed more easily than Garrett expected, Ruby talking about school. Eleanor sharing a story about a student she was tutoring, Vanessa actually listening instead of waiting for her turn to redirect attention. When their food arrived, they ate together with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to be present with each other rather than perform. Near the end of the meal, Vanessa addressed Garrett directly with an observation that seemed to surprise her as she spoke it. You know what I just realized? This is the first time I've been genuinely happy in years. Not performing happiness for social media or pretending everything's perfect for appearances. Just actually content to be here with people who know all my flaws and still chose to share a meal with me. That's what real relationship looks like. Garrett kept his voice gentle, knowing someone completely and choosing them anyway. It's harder than the performance version, but it's the only kind that actually sustains you. I'm learning that, slowly, painfully, but I'm learning. Ruby reached across the table and took her mother's hand, with the unself-conscious affection of a child who still believed adults could change. I'm proud of you, Mom, for trying. The simple statement broke something in Vanessa that had been holding back tears. She cried quietly while Eleanor rubbed her shoulder, and Garrett pretended to be very interested in his remaining fries. And Ruby maintained her grip on her mother's hand, with fierce determination. When they left the restaurant an hour later, Garrett stood in the parking lot and watched Eleanor walk Vanessa to her car, the two women talking intently about something he couldn't hear. Ruby leaned against his side, full and tired and happy in the uncomplicated way of children, whose adults had finally stopped making everything unnecessarily difficult. Dad, are you glad you helped Grandmother Eleanor that night? Garrett thought about the past 6 months, the lost contracts and custody battle, and moments of terror when he'd thought he might lose Ruby forever. Thought about Eleanor's face when Ruby called her grandmother without hesitation. About Vanessa attempting genuine change instead of strategic image management. About the lesson Ruby had learned watching her father choose compassion when it would have been easier to walk away. Yeah, baby, I'm glad. It was hard and scary and it cost us things. But it also gave us a family that's real instead of pretend. That's worth every difficult moment. Ruby absorbed this in comfortable silence. Eleanor and Vanessa finished their conversation with an embrace that looked tentative but genuine. Vanessa drove away with a wave that included all of them rather than just Ruby. Eleanor approached with tears still drying on her face, but something like peace in her expression. "Thank you, Garrett, for all of it. For not giving up on me when it would have been smarter to walk away. For teaching my daughter that people deserve second chances. For showing Ruby that compassion isn't weakness. I didn't do it alone. You saved Ruby's life. You wore a wire to catch a con artist. You forgave Vanessa when most people would have written her off completely. That took more courage than anything I did. Maybe we saved each other. You gave me back my granddaughter and my daughter. I gave you the opportunity to teach Ruby the lesson she needed most." They stood together in the parking lot where 6 months ago Garrett had made the choice that would define everything that followed to pay a restaurant bill for a woman who'd wronged him, to offer compassion when bitterness would have been justified, to prioritize what was right over what was convenient. The decision had cost him contracts and sleep and months of anxiety about losing Ruby. It had also given him a family that was complicated and imperfect, but fundamentally real, bound by choice rather than obligation, by compassion rather than convenience. Ruby yawned against his side. "Can we go home now? I'm tired." "Yeah, baby, let's go home." They drove through familiar streets in comfortable silence, past the church where Pastor Caleb had offered counsel when everything seemed impossible, past the hospital where Eleanor had saved Ruby's life, past the courthouse where Judge Richardson had validated the choice to prioritize people over comfort. Home was the small house Garrett had bought with divorce settlement money. Nothing impressive by Vanessa's standards, but sufficient for its purpose. Ruby fell asleep on the couch before making it to her room. Garrett carried her to bed, tucked her in with the same care he'd exercised every night for 11 years, and stood watching her sleep with gratitude so intense it felt like prayer. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Thank you for tonight, for everything. I'm the luckiest grandmother alive." Another text from Vanessa. "I know I don't deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful you gave it anyway. Ruby is lucky to have you. I was too even when I was too stupid to recognize it." Garrett sat at his kitchen table with cold coffee and the satisfaction of someone who'd chosen difficulty over ease and discovered it led somewhere worth reaching. The past 6 months had taught him that doing right didn't guarantee happy endings or exempt you from consequences. But it did create space for healing that couldn't exist in relationships built on performance and pretense. Ruby had learned the lesson he most wanted her to understand, that people mattered more than comfort. That compassion wasn't conditional, that we helped those who needed us, even when it complicated our carefully constructed lives. She'd watched him choose integrity when safety beckoned, and somehow that choice had created possibility for redemption Garrett hadn't believed achievable. Eleanor had her granddaughter and nascent reconciliation with her daughter. Vanessa had stumbling progress toward becoming the mother Ruby deserved. Ruby had a family that was messy and imperfect, but fundamentally committed to growth over image. And Garrett had the knowledge that when crisis demanded choice, he'd selected compassion over bitterness and discovered it led to grace he couldn't have engineered through strategy or self-protection. The universe didn't guarantee reward for moral choices. But sometimes, not always. But sometimes doing what was right when it was hard. Opened doors that staying safe would have kept permanently closed. And in those moments, the cost became investment rather than sacrifice. The difficulty became growth rather than suffering. Garrett turned off the kitchen light and headed to bed, exhausted and grateful in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, electrical jobs to finish bills, to pay Ruby's daily needs, to meet Eleanor's ongoing recovery, to support Vanessa's fragile progress, to encourage. The work of building real relationship rather than performing acceptable ones never truly finished. But tonight, in this moment, Garrett Sullivan could rest in the knowledge that he'd taught his daughter the most important lesson a parent could offer, that we become who we are, through choices made when no one's watching and nothing's forcing our hand. And that choosing compassion over convenience defined character more accurately than any credential or bank balance ever could. The house settled into nighttime quiet. Outside, spring promised summer with the patient certainty of seasons that cycled regardless of human drama. And inside, a father who'd risked everything for basic human decency slept with conscience clear and family intact, proof that doing right didn't always cost everything. Sometimes it gave back more than you'd known to ask for.